The convoy waited on the edge of the road, just after sunrise, its trucks lined in a rough row, with engines already running and thin smoke rising into the cold air. And the sound of motors filled the space, where voices had gone quiet as people stood holding papers and small bundles, knowing that once the trucks moved, there would be no turning back. The woman stood a few steps away from the line, not close enough to be counted and not far enough to leave, her boots planted in the frozen dirt, as if she might still be pulled forward if she stayed still long enough. She had been awake since before light, walking from the edge of town after hearing that a convoy would pass through. And now, she watched names being called while soldiers checked lists against worn documents. Each time a name was spoken, someone stepped forward and climbed onto a truck, helped by a hand or a quick nod, and the space beside her grew emptier as the road cleared. She kept her papers folded tight in both hands, careful not to drop them, because she had been told that without them, she would not even be allowed to stand there. Her coat was too thin for the season, and she could feel the cold through the cloth. But she did not move or complain, knowing that attention could work against her as easily as it could help. One truck after another was sealed, canvas pulled down and tied, while the officer at the front of the line checked his watch and spoke quietly to the men beside him. The woman shifted her weight once, then stopped, afraid that any movement might mark her as impatient or unfit, and she looked instead at the back of the nearest truck, counting the scratches in the wood to steady herself. Somewhere behind her, someone whispered that the convoy was already full, and the sound made her chest tighten, even though no one had spoken to her directly. She had been denied places before, turned away from doors and told to wait for help that never came, and the feeling returned now, heavy and familiar, as the last few civilians were waved forward. A soldier glanced at her once and then looked away, already thinking of the road ahead, and the engines grew louder, as if the trucks were eager to leave. The woman stood alone beside the convoy, not crying and not calling out, only waiting, while the space for her narrowed with every passing second, and the morning slipped away. The road had once been a busy route between towns, but now it served only one purpose: to move people away before the day ended and the curfew closed everything again. And the woman knew this because she had followed the sound of engines long before she could see the trucks. The convoy had arrived before full daylight, stopping in a loose formation, while soldiers set up a short line and told civilians to bring their papers forward in order. And the process was meant to be calm and fair, even though it rarely felt that way to those waiting. She had reached the road just as the first names were called, her breath unsteady from the walk and the cold, and she had taken her place at the side, not wanting to push ahead of anyone who had arrived earlier. Around her stood other civilians, some with small cases, some with nothing at all, all of them quiet and watchful, listening for their names as if listening for permission to exist. The woman checked her papers again, smoothing the edges that had begun to tear from being folded and unfolded so many times, and she told herself that everything was in order, even if her hands shook as she held them. She had been instructed days earlier to report to a collection point that never opened, then told to try again at a different hour, and each delay had cost her strength and certainty, leaving her tired but still determined to keep moving. When the convoy finally stopped in front of her town, she felt a brief sense of relief, believing that if she had made it this far, then she would surely be allowed to go on. The trucks were not marked for comfort, only for transport, and she understood that there would be no seats or warmth beyond what she carried with her. But safety mattered more than ease now. An officer stood near the front with a clipboard, calling names in a clear voice, while another checked documents and pointed people toward open trucks, and the system worked quickly for those who were prepared. As each truck filled, the canvas was pulled down and tied, and the people inside disappeared from view, becoming numbers on a page instead of faces on the road. The woman stayed where she was, stepping forward only when the line moved closer, and she noticed that no one had yet asked for her papers. Time passed in short, heavy minutes, and the air smelled of fuel and damp earth as the engines continued to idle. A soldier walked past her carrying supplies and did not look up, and she wondered if she had placed herself too far to the side to be seen at all. Still, she did not force her way forward or call for attention, believing that order mattered here and that patience might protect her better than insistence. As the last few names were called, she looked down the road in the direction the convoy would travel, trying to imagine herself on one of the trucks instead of standing in the open. And she waited, quiet and still, for someone to finally notice that she was there. When the officer reached the end of his list, he paused and looked at the remaining civilians with a tired expression that suggested the decision had already been made, and the woman felt the shift before anyone spoke to her directly. One of the soldiers gestured toward the trucks and said there was no more room, explaining in a flat voice that the convoy was already full and could not take anyone else. The words were not shouted or harsh, but they landed with weight, and the woman understood that she was being placed outside the plan without any discussion. She stepped forward slightly and held out her papers, hoping that once they were seen the situation might change. But the soldier shook his head and told her to wait back until the trucks had moved. Around her, people who had already been accepted climbed higher onto the trucks or adjusted their bundles, careful not to look at her for too long, as if attention might somehow reverse their own luck. The road felt suddenly wider, and the space between her and the convoy became more noticeable, marking her as separate without anyone needing to say it aloud. She lowered her papers and took a step back, doing exactly as she was told, even though the instruction offered no solution beyond standing aside. The cold pressed in more sharply now that she was no longer focused on the process, and she tucked her hands into her sleeves to keep them from trembling. A soldier tied down the last canvas flap and moved on, and the sound of rope sliding against wood felt final, like a door closing. Someone near the line muttered that there would be another convoy soon, but the tone suggested doubt rather than reassurance, and the woman did not respond or ask questions. She had heard promises before, offered easily when responsibility ended, and she had learned not to build hope on words alone. The officer checked his watch again and spoke to the drivers, signaling that they should be ready to move, and the engines grew louder in response. No one checked her papers, and no one explained why she had been left out, only that there was no place for her now. She stood still, not wanting to appear desperate or demanding, because she knew that such behavior could make things worse rather than better. The denial was quiet and procedural, delivered without cruelty, but without care, and that made it harder to argue against. As the convoy prepared to leave, the woman found herself looking down at the dirt by her feet, focusing on the small details of the ground so she would not have to watch the trucks pull away without her. The hardship was not just the danger of being left behind, but the knowledge that she had followed every instruction given to her and still been turned aside, as if her effort and patience carried no weight at all. As the trucks sat ready and the road grew quieter, the reason for her exclusion began to take shape in small comments rather than clear explanations, and the woman sensed it, even though no one addressed her directly. A man standing near the supplies said that only priority cases were allowed on this movement, and another replied that some people slowed convoys and caused trouble later on. The words were not aimed at her by name, but they hung close enough that she understood she was being described without being spoken to. Someone glanced at her papers and said they looked incomplete, even though no one had taken them from her hands to check, and the idea settled quickly among those nearby. She remained still, aware that defending herself might confirm the label being placed on her, and she chose silence instead. The rumor moved faster than any formal decision, turning her from an overlooked civilian into a quiet problem that no one wanted to deal with before departure. A soldier walked past and asked briefly why she was still standing there, and another answered for her, saying she was not cleared and should step further back. The answer was accepted without question, and the woman felt herself pushed a little farther from the line without anyone touching her. She obeyed, moving to the edge of the road where the dirt gave way to frozen grass, and she kept her eyes lowered so she would not appear defiant. The mislabel did not accuse her of wrongdoing, but it carried enough doubt to make assistance seem unnecessary, as if leaving her behind was simply part of maintaining order. She noticed that conversations resumed once she was no longer close, and the focus returned to fuel levels and timing rather than people. The convoy had become a machine again, and she had been removed from its consideration. The exclusion was complete without being formally announced, and that made it feel final, even though no document recorded it. She stood alone with her papers still folded in her hands, no longer expecting them to be asked for, and she waited only because she had nowhere else to go. The road ahead remained blocked by trucks, and the town behind her offered no shelter before nightfall. The rumor had done its work quietly, placing her outside protection while keeping the process clean and efficient. She accepted the position she had been given, not because she believed it was right, but because resisting it seemed impossible in that moment. And she prepared herself for the sound of engines pulling away without her. The British driver had been loading the last crates onto his truck when he noticed that one woman had not moved away with the others, and the stillness of her position caught his attention more than any raised voice would have. He had been on convoy duty long enough to recognize the usual signs of delay and disorder, but this was different because there was no argument and no visible problem, only a person left standing where movement had already ended. He paused with his hands on the edge of the truck bed and looked again, seeing her boots planted in the dirt and her papers held carefully against her coat, as if she expected them to be taken at any moment. Around her, the road had cleared, and the space she occupied felt exposed, making her presence more noticeable now that the system had moved past her. The driver did not approach right away, because he understood that stepping in without understanding could create more trouble than it solved, and he took a moment to watch instead. He saw that no one had checked her documents and that no mark had been made beside her name, if her name was even on the list at all, and this detail mattered to him more than the comments he had overheard. The rumor that she was not cleared did not match the order he was used to, where decisions were recorded and space was accounted for, and the gap between procedure and outcome stood out clearly to him. He climbed down from the truck and walked a short distance toward the officer in charge, asking in a calm voice whether all civilians had been processed, and the officer replied that the convoy was full and ready to move. The answer did not explain why one person remained, and the driver nodded without arguing, choosing instead to look at the list himself when it was set down for a moment. He saw that several names had been crossed out and others added late, and that there was still room recorded on his truck, even if it was not meant for comfort. The woman remained where she was, not watching him and not calling for help, and this restraint confirmed what he already suspected, that she was not trying to force her way in, but had simply been overlooked or set aside. The driver returned to his truck and took a blanket from the supplies, holding it loosely as he looked once more toward the road, weighing his responsibility against the time pressure of departure. He understood that his role was not to make speeches or challenge authority, but to ensure that the convoy moved people safely and correctly, and leaving someone behind without a clear reason did not fit that duty. As the engines continued to idle, he made a quiet decision to act within the limits of his position, not as a gesture of kindness alone, but as a correction to a process that had failed to notice one person standing in plain sight. The driver waited until the officer stepped away to speak with another unit, then moved with purpose rather than urgency, because he knew that calm action carried more weight here than insistence. He approached the woman first, stopping a short distance from her, so as not to startle her or draw attention, and he asked quietly to see her papers, using the same tone he used with everyone else assigned to his truck. She looked up at him for the first time, surprised but not hopeful, and handed the documents over without comment, her movements careful and restrained. He checked the details slowly, reading each line to be sure he did not miss anything, and he saw that her name and status matched the movement category assigned to the convoy that morning. There was nothing in the papers that explained why she had been set aside, no mark or note that would justify leaving her behind, and this confirmation gave him the certainty he needed to continue. He walked back to the officer with the papers in hand and waited until he was acknowledged, then pointed to the line where her name appeared and to the empty space recorded on his truck. He did not raise his voice or question the authority of the list, only noted that the count allowed for one more person and that the woman had not been processed. The officer looked at the page, then at the trucks, and hesitated, aware of the time and the attention beginning to turn toward the delay. Rather than argue, the driver suggested placing her on the supply truck, explaining that there was room and that it would not slow the convoy, framing the solution as a practical adjustment rather than an exception. The officer considered this briefly, then nodded without comment, signaling that the decision was acceptable as long as it did not disrupt departure. The exchange was quiet and procedural, witnessed by only a few nearby soldiers, and it ended as simply as it began. The driver returned to the woman and told her, in plain words, that she would be coming along and that she should follow him to the truck. She did not respond right away, as if waiting for the instruction to be withdrawn, and when she finally moved, it was with cautious steps that showed she did not yet trust the change. He placed the blanket over his arm and guided her to the rear of the truck, explaining where to step and where to hold on, treating the action as routine rather than remarkable. The intervention did not draw attention or invite approval, but it corrected the earlier exclusion through the same orderly process that had caused it, restoring her place without making her feel like a burden or a favor. The driver positioned himself beside the rear of the truck and showed her where to place her foot, steadying the side rail with one hand while holding the blanket with the other, and the movement was careful rather than rushed, as if there were no clock pressing them forward. She climbed with effort, her body stiff from the cold and from hours of holding herself still, and when she reached the truck bed, he lifted her the last short distance so she would not slip. There was no audience for the moment, only the sound of engines and the low voices of men finishing their tasks, and the lack of attention made the action feel normal instead of dramatic. He guided her to a space between crates, where she could sit without being in the way, then placed the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it in just enough to keep the wind from cutting through. She sat upright, hands folded in her lap, unsure whether she should thank him or remain silent, and he gave a small nod that suggested no response was needed. The papers were returned to her, and he told her to keep them close, using the same instruction given to everyone else on board. As he stepped down from the truck, he checked the ropes once more and secured the canvas, making sure it did not brush against her face when the vehicle moved. The officer gave a short signal, and one by one, the trucks began to pull forward, the line shifting into motion with a slow, steady rhythm. From her place on the truck, she felt the ground move beneath her for the first time that morning, and the sensation brought a quiet sense of relief that she did not show on her face. The road ahead opened gradually, the town falling behind without ceremony, and the space she had occupied on the roadside was filled only by tracks in the dirt. No one spoke to her as the convoy moved, and she did not speak either, content to sit still and follow instructions as she had tried to do all along. The driver walked alongside his truck for a short distance before climbing into the cab, glancing back once to be sure she was settled before facing forward again. The transfer had been completed without delay or disorder, fitting neatly into the flow of departure as if it had always been planned that way. As the convoy gained speed, the woman adjusted the blanket and looked straight ahead, aware that she was now moving toward safety, not because she had demanded it, but because someone had noticed that she belonged there. As the convoy settled into its pace, the initial tension faded into the steady sound of engines and tires, and the woman became simply another person being carried forward, rather than an exception under watch. A clerk moved down the line at the next pause point, checking counts against the list without comment. And when he reached her truck, he marked the space as occupied and moved on. The action, small but final. No one questioned her presence, and no explanation was requested, because the record now matched reality, and that alignment mattered more than earlier doubts. She adjusted her posture and sat straighter, the blanket still around her shoulders, and she felt the quiet shift that came when a situation was no longer uncertain. The rumor that had followed her at the roadside did not come with her. They left behind with the dust and the cold, and the label that had set her apart lost its force once the convoy moved. A soldier offered a canteen to the group on the truck bed and passed it along without pausing, and when it reached her, she took a small drink and returned it in the same manner, unremarkable and included. The driver kept his focus on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, and he did not look back again, trusting that the process had been completed correctly and needed no further attention. The woman held her papers once more, then folded them and placed them inside her coat, aware that they had finally served their purpose, without requiring her to plead or explain. As the trucks passed through a checkpoint, the guards waved them through with practiced gestures, counting vehicles rather than faces, and the woman felt the difference between being seen as a problem and being counted as present. The recognition did not arrive as praise or comfort, but as the absence of resistance, and that absence allowed her to breathe more freely. She watched the roadside move past in a blur of fields and damaged buildings, and she understood that her dignity had been restored not by attention, but by inclusion that asked nothing extra of her. The convoy stopped briefly near a bridge to adjust spacing, and the pause was handled quickly, the routine maintained, the order intact. When the trucks moved again, she remained seated and calm, no longer bracing for removal or correction. The quiet acceptance carried more weight than any spoken assurance, and she held on to it as the day advanced. In the shared silence of transport, her place was secured, and the simple fact of moving forward with the others confirmed that she had not been a burden or a delay, but a person whose presence belonged on the list once it was properly checked. By the time the convoy slowed again, the light had shifted, and the day was already moving toward its end, and the woman felt the change in the air before she saw it in the sky. The trucks turned off the main road and followed a marked route toward a temporary holding area where civilians would be directed onward, and the movement was handled without ceremony. Just another task completed according to plan. When the engines finally stopped, she remained seated until instructed to climb down, waiting as she had learned to do, trusting the order now that it had carried her this far. A soldier untied the canvas and gestured for the group to dismount, and she stepped carefully back onto the ground, her legs unsteady, but her posture composed. She adjusted her coat and returned the blanket to a supply stack without being asked, understanding that nothing given to her was meant to be kept. Around her, other civilians moved in the same quiet way, guided toward shelter for the night, where names would be checked again and space assigned. No one spoke about the road behind them or the decision that had nearly left her there, because the convoy had already moved on from that moment, and so had she. Inside the shelter, she was shown a place to sit, and later a spot to sleep. Nothing private or soft, but inside and protected from the cold, and that was enough. She lay down fully dressed, her papers folded and placed beside her, and listened to the muted sounds of others settling in, the low rhythm of shared breathing replacing the noise of engines. The war did not pause for her arrival, and there was no sense of victory in the room, only the steady continuation of routine under strain. Somewhere beyond the walls, movements were still being planned and roads still being watched, and tomorrow would bring new instructions for everyone present. For now, the woman closed her eyes, knowing that she had not been left outside when the trucks moved, and that knowledge carried a quiet weight of its own. She had been denied, mislabeled, and set aside. But she had also been seen, checked, and included through simple responsibility, rather than spectacle. As night settled, the shelter grew still, and she slept inside, while the war continued elsewhere, without notice or pause.